Hello students, today's topic is classical conditioning theory. It is a form of learning where we found an association between a stimulus and a response. The classical conditioning theory was proposed by Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov. According to this theory, behavior is learnt by a repetitive association between the response and the stimulus. Here, an organism learns to transfer response from one stimulus to a previously neutral stimulus. Here, repetitive association again and again is formed between the response and the stimulus. Now, here we will study what is stimulus and what is response. Stimulus is something that can elicit or evoke a response in a cell, a tissue, or an organism. It can be external or internal. Response is a reaction to a specific stimulus. Being provoked by the stimulus, response is there. Whenever there is a stimulus, a response will be there. For example, the body temperature is raised by release of chemicals in white blood cells. This increased temperature kills bacteria and inhibits the viruses. Now, in this example, the stimuli is the bacterial infection and response is the fever. Another response for internal stimuli is when we ingest poison. Nobody do this, but let's take example. If someone or by some chance poison is ingested, that is a stimuli resulting in vomiting. Here, diagrammatically and in more simple terms, and stimulus is an event, sensation, or experience that causes us to react. Sensation is through our sense organs like eyes, that is known as visual stimulus, olfactory, nose, gustatory, tongue, auditory, ear, and kinesthetic through touch. Conditioning, as we are studying about the classical conditioning, so this word is quite new for us. So we must understand it. What is conditioning? In physiology, a behavioral response whereby a response becomes more frequent or more predictable in a given environment as a result of reinforcement, with the reinforcement typically being conditioning as a stimulus or reward for a desired response. There are three main types of learning: classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning. Both classical and operant conditioning, they are the forms of associative learning, because here associations are formed where associations are made between events that occur together. Now there is a experiment that was conducted by the Pavlov and known as the Pavlov's dog experiment. In the 1890s, Russian scientist Ivan Pavlov was studying aspects of the digestive process by observing salivation in dogs. When he made the observation that dogs began to salivate before the food arrived. For example, at the sight of the food tray, a sound of the assistant's footsteps carried the food. This work became the foundation for classical conditioning and the behavioral approach to psychology. As we are studying in this, are seeing in this diagram, Pavlov, he designed an experiment to understand classical conditioning in detail. In the first phase, his dog was placed in a box and harnessed. In the meantime, a surgery was conducted and one end of the tube was inserted in the dog's jaw and other end of the tube was put in the measuring glass for measuring saliva when the dog secretes. Here, as we are seeing during the experiment, before conditioning, Bell was rung, and when bell was rung, there was no saliva. Bell acts as a neutral stimulus because it was not able to provoke the response. So, bell is a neutral stimulus, and before conditioning, before the experiment begins, the food, when presented to the dog, the saliva starts secreting. The food is an unconditioned stimulus because it is a natural process. Even not only dogs, even humans also, the watering of mouth is very common, having the smell of the food. So unconditioned stimulus is the food here, and salivation is an unconditioned response. So during conditioning, the bell was rung, and along with the bell, the food was given to the dog. And after that, salivation happens. But till now, the saliva is because of the food, not because of the bell. So it is still unconditioned response. After repetitive trials, means a number of times when well and food was given together, a stage comes when only with the sound of the bell the dog starts secreting saliva. So here association has been formed between the neutral stimulus bell and the unconditioned stimulus food. So here we can say now saliva is not because of the food but because of the bell. So now salivation is known as the conditioned response. Now here diagram is clearly explaining itself that before conditioning, unconditioned stimulus and unconditioned response. During conditioning, there is an unconditioned response, and after conditioning there is a conditioned stimulus and conditioned response. Look here, the same stimulus bell before conditioning was the neutral stimulus. Now after a number of associations it becomes the conditioned stimulus here. Pavlov developed some rather unfriendly technical terms to describe this process. The unconditioned stimulus is the object or event that originally produces the reflexive natural response. The response to this is called the unconditioned response. The neutral stimulus is a new stimulus that does not produce a response, as bell in the case. Once the neutral stimulus has become associated with the unconditioned stimulus, it becomes a conditioned stimulus. The conditioned response is the response to the conditioned stimulus. Some key principles of classical conditioning here. Acquisition. Acquisition is the initial stage of learning where a response is first established and gradually strengthened. During the acquisition phase of classical conditioning, a neutral stimulus is repeatedly paired with an unconditioned stimulus. As we may recall, an unconditioned stimulus is something that naturally and automatically triggers a response without any learning. After the association is made, the subject will begin to emit a behavior in response to the previously neutral stimulus, which is now known as a conditioned stimulus. It is at this point that we can see that the response has been acquired. For example, imagine that you are conditioning a dog to salivate in response to the sound of a bell. You repeatedly pair the presentation of the food with the sound of the bell. You can say the response has been acquired as soon as the dog begins to salivate in response to the bell tone. Once the response has been established, you can gradually reinforce the salivation response to make sure the behavior is well learned. Extinction. Extinction is when the occurrences of a conditioned response decrease or disappear. In classical conditioning, this happens when a conditioned stimulus is no longer paired with an unconditioned stimulus. For example, if the smell of the food had been paired with the sound of a whistle, it would eventually come to evoke the conditioned response of hunger. As in this case, we have taken the bell instead of whistle. However, if the unconditioned stimulus were no longer paired with the conditioned stimulus, the bell, eventually the conditioned response would disappear. Stimulus generalization. Stimulus generalization is the tendency for the conditioned stimulus to evoke similar responses after the response has been conditioned. For example, if a dog has been conditioned to salivate at the sound of a bell, the animal may also exhibit the same response to stimuli that are similar to the conditioned stimulus. In John Watson's famous Little Albert experiment, for example, a small child was conditioned to fear a white rat. The child demonstrated stimulus generalization while also exhibiting fear in response to other fuzzy white objects, including stuffed toys and Watson's own hair. Stimulus discrimination. Discrimination is the learned ability to distinguish between a conditioned stimulus and other stimuli that do not signal an unconditioned stimuli. Means here you should be able to discriminate between the two sounds. Spontaneous recovery. Sometimes a learned response can suddenly re-emerge even after a period of extinction. Spontaneous recovery is the reappearance of the conditioned response after a rest period or period of lessened response. For example, imagine that after training a dog to salivate to the sound of a bell, you stop reinforcing the behavior and the response eventually becomes extinct. After a rest period during which the conditioned stimulus is not presented, like the food is, you suddenly ring the bell and the animal spontaneously recovers the previously learned response. If the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus are no longer associated, extinction will occur very rapidly after a spontaneous recovery. Here, types of conditioning also. The forward conditioning, it occurs when a neutral stimulus, as in this case, the bell was the neutral stimulus that appears just before and during the presentation of the unconditioned stimulus. And food was the unconditioned stimulus. For example, bell was rung before the presentation of the food. It is of two types, delayed conditioning. The conditioned stimulus is presented before the unconditioned and it stays on until the unconditioned stimulus is presented. The bell keep on ringing until the food is presented. This is generally the best, especially when the delay is short. Trace conditioning. Discrete event is presented, then the unconditioned stimulus occurs. Shorter the interval, the better, but as you can tell, this approach is not very effective. Backward conditioning also. Backward conditioning occurs when a conditioned stimulus immediately follows an unconditioned stimulus. Unconditioned stimulus means food here. If we are considering the same example we have just studied now. Simultaneous conditioning. Both conditioned and unconditioned stimulus occurs and terminates at the same time. The food and the bell both are presented at the same time. Second order and the higher order conditioning. This form of conditioning follows a two-step procedure. First, a neutral stimulus comes to signal a unconditioned stimulus through forward conditioning. Then a second neutral stimulus is paired with the first and comes to yield its own conditioned response. Temporal conditioning. In temporal conditioning, a conditioned stimulus is presented at regular intervals. For instance, every 10 minutes. So here it's all about the classical conditioning. Thank you very much.